Let's please give a warm welcome for Gary Younge and Caryl Phillips.
More whooping, please. More whooping. More whooping. There we go. Thank you. So welcome. My name is Gary Younge. This is Caryl Phillips, and we're here to talk about his book, Another Man in the Street. Another Man in the Street traces the story of a Syncretician called Victor, who comes to England leaving behind a wife and a child, and also leaving behind a sort of embittered father who tells him he's going to be no better than he should be. And he comes to England to pursue the dream of becoming a journalist. And I think it's John Berger who has the line, they came looking for the gold in the streets, but the gold dropped from very high in the sky, so it fell very deep, and they couldn't find it. So he comes with the dream of being a journalist, but he ends up working in a pub, and while he's working in a pub, he meets a man called Peter, who is definitely Eastern European, and I think is Polish and Jewish, and a slum landlord. And this is in Notting Hill. And Victor goes to work for Peter, and Peter has a girlfriend, let's say, called Ruth. Ruth leaves Peter and ends up with Victor. Well, it's not a mystery, though, is it? It's not a mystery. It's not like... And then there's a car chase. Yeah. Anyway, Victor did it. Well, it all ends up very sadly. I'm going to leave it there. And... Caryl, is there anything else you would like to share about the plot?
I think B+. No, thank you. We were discussing upstairs who was going to do that, and I won. so no, thank you. I think other things will come out when we talk.
Yeah. To me, it was a story primarily about loss in a range of ways. We are both the children of immigrants, and there is something that you gain through immigration. And as a human being, as a person, there are also things that you lose. And it very much depends, I guess, on why you leave and what you're leaving for. And the thing that it really made me think about Carol's book was this quote from Primo Levi, "This is a man." And he's writing about the camps, and he says, "We who survived the camp are not true witnesses. We, the survivors, are not only a tiny, but an anomalous minority. We are those who, through prevarication, skill, or luck, never touched bottom. Those who have seen the face of the Gorgon, and they did not return, or they returned wordless." And that's where I wanted to start, because part of the dilemma in the book is that the two men in particular, Peter and Victor, come from their particular situations unable, it feels like they're unable to articulate the pain that they've experienced. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, I think when I was listening to that, you said there are things that you gain from migration. I think maybe it's not for me to say what the book's about, but I'm always been interested in what you lose with migration. What happens to people who cross water, or the other migrant in this book is Ruth, who's from the north of England, and migration from the north of England to London, I think, is a huge migration too, particularly so given the fact that she migrated in the 1960s. And, there's a whole genre of British cultural production which features working class people in the north of England trying to get to London to reinvent themselves. There's Julie Christie at the end of Billy Liar, on the train platform with David Story's second novel, Flight to Camden. There's a whole genre of migrations that working class people made to London, which was transformative, but also involved loss for them as well. And I think in this novel, I think Ruth does lose a lot by moving from Sheffield, I can't remember, but I think Sheffield or near Sheffield to London. So there is the loss which you're referring to. I think has always concerned me. Let me ask you a quick question. What do you think are the gains that people make in migration?
Well, it feels to me like generally speaking, it can be security, it could be financial security, it could be that the place that you're from is too small. That's what I felt like for my mum leaving Barbados, that it wasn't going to be able to contain her, this relatively small place, and that there was an ambition to see the world. So I think, you're either running from something, that was Peter, or you're running towards something.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is that those gains that people make, and in a sense, in this novel, Victor does make gains by coming. He escapes the potential, like many Caribbean people in the 50s and 60s. You escape the potential of being working in the cane fields. You escape the potential of a job as a unskilled blue-collar worker. You have the ability to reinvent yourself, or go to college, or in his case, try and become a journalist and end up working on a broadsheet newspaper. So you have all that potential, but the question, I think, in his case and in Peter's case, is always behind the beat of perceived success is always, or not always, but in this case, a kind of catastrophic loss of self. There's a price to be paid for those gains, which we don't always see.
Yeah, it's that both of them reinvent themselves, or seek to reinvent themselves, and in that reinvention, they kind of curate the stories of their lives. There's a bit here that I'd be interested in you talking to. This is Peter's reflections, and he says, "When you leave, you must travel with as little luggage as possible. Please, not even memories. There must be nothing to burden the hands or bulge the pockets or trouble the mind." Which is like he's leaving a certain circumstance, but that sort of works as well for Victor, right?
Well, yeah, what do migrants carry with them when they leave? They have classic, in this case, classic Windrush photographs always show West Indians coming down a gangplank holding a cardboard suitcase which is stuffed with their belongings. They carry their belongings with them. But that cardboard suitcase is not important, because if it gets lost, if they come on a plane and it's British Airways, it will get lost. And if it's lost and discarded, it doesn't matter because that's not the primary thing that they're carrying with them. The primary thing they're carrying with them are memories of this word. I think I've said this to you before, but they're carrying the most problematic word in the English language with them, inside of themselves. And that word is home. And the memories which constitute home, immediately on contact with the new country, become a combination of dangerous and toxic. And that's the burden that they're carrying, how to stitch together the old place with the new place and where to fit the word home into that equation. And again, coming back to what you were saying about the two blokes in the novel who migrate, Peter from Central Europe and Victor from the Caribbean, they're both grappling throughout the whole book with a real question of what on earth is home.
Yeah, and you see that explicitly with Victor. Well, you see it explicitly with both, but at a certain point, Victor says that, I want to go home. I want to go home, and it's he's not in a position where he can actually articulate what home is. But it also leaves them, and this comes back to that Primo Levi quote, unable. It leaves them emotionally mute to the point where they can't, with their loved ones and with the people who matter to them, they can't tell their whole story. There's a place that they can't go. They can't get back to.
Well, I mean, you again, when we were sitting upstairs, we're talking about somebody, and you said, well, he's made a long journey. Migrants, once they arrive in a country, have not stopped making the journey. The journey is continual because the journey is an ongoing navigation of how to stitch together this new place with the old place, and the struggle is ongoing. It's particularly critical and difficult if the country you've gone to doesn't want you. Then it becomes really problematic because you've got the external problems of migration, which we've talked a little bit about, which is, job, house, education for your children, hopefully an advancement by an educational possibility, night school. We've got all the possibility of improving oneself, and some people achieve that, as we know. But behind the beat of that is the internal dereliction that can come with dealing with the fact that people don't see you, people don't know who you are, people don't understand who you are, people want to impose their identity of who you are to them upon you. And so you may well be doing very well, you may well have your advancement, you may get your semi-detached house, your kids may go to a nice school, they may even go to college, but inside of you something is happening to you which is making it very difficult to see yourself, very difficult to explain who you are to your children, very difficult to explain what you've done to yourself in this society where almost from the beginning of your residence in this place, you have to say to somebody, my name's not Sunshine. Don't call me that. Because their version of who you are means you're always in danger of losing yourself.
There is this line here where he, which really struck me, and he's explaining himself to his current partner. This is Victor, and he says, "I tried to be me. Even when I wasn't sure of what I'm doing, I was always trying to hold on to some dignity. Maybe that's a mistake, my mistake, that I tried too hard to be dignified when I know full well that all you people see is the color and not the man. And that made me think of a person who knows their place and refuses to occupy it.
Yeah, I'm like that.
Well, it's kind of dangerous to be that, you know. I mean, it invites, obviously, it's affirming, it's self-affirming, but there's always someone with a billy club or a law who's keen to teach you what your place is, don't you think?
I don't just think, I know that. You know that too. You know, they don't always have to have a uniform on either. But that's part of the struggle to hold on to who you are, because if a whole society's view of you is not recognizing who you are, and certainly not recognizing your full potential, and reducing you to names or abbreviations, or, you know, your struggle to hold on to your sense of self, whilst at the same time still trying to advance in society, is a titanic struggle. It's an interior struggle, which is why it's a deeply interior struggle, and it's a struggle that can't always be articulated, which is why I feel lucky to be a novelist, because a novel is the art form which best captures the interiority of people's lives. It's the art form which can explain to you, because a character will speak directly to you, not through any other mediated prism, will speak directly to you of the thing that they fear most at 3 o'clock in the morning when they wake up. You will know what they're thinking, and you will know what they're fearing, and you will know what they cannot articulate. It's one of the few art forms in which you can actually explain or utilize the voice of somebody who might otherwise be perceived of as being mentally ill. Because the interior unspooling of somebody who has what we might term an excess of subjectivity, where things have gone slightly out of whack, is perfectly suited to the novel. So being able to utilize a voice and then get to the inner fears of somebody, I think better represents the story of what it means to be a migrant than just focusing on, oh, there was a sign in the window that said no coloreds, no dogs, no Irish, and I couldn't get a job on the buses. And we know that. That's sociology, that's politics, it's real. But the real story of migrants' lives is the destruction that happens deep inside of themselves, or the challenges they have to feel when they're losing sight of who they are.
And I read this in an interview that you did about the book, so it may or may not be.
It's not true.
So it may or may not be true, yeah, because, you know, I know what you're like. But that the idea, the root of the book came from some non-fiction research you were doing, which you then converted into a fictional story. So do you want to tell us a bit about just how you came to that subject?
I think I was already thinking about things before, but I decided I wanted to write an article about the slum landlord Peter Rackman, you know, who rented properties in Notting Hill in the 1950s, mainly to West Indians and to prostitutes. And he was a Holocaust survivor. He came from Poland, and he was vilified, and he continued to be vilified, because Rackmanism is in the Oxford English Dictionary, meaning a rapacious slum landlord. And the more I kind of scrambled around and looked at Rackman, the more I realized that actually I'd never actually met a West Indian who had a bad word to say about Rackman. So why was he being vilified in this manner? Why is his name synonymous with exploitation? And he gave, he rented properties. Yes, he rented them at exorbitant rents, and yes, they weren't always that, sanitary. but he rented them. He gave people a roof over their heads. Then it became very clear with a little bit of scrambling, and I'm certainly not the first person to figure this out, is that Rachman died in the early 60s, and at the time when the Profumo trial became sub judice and nobody could report on it, the press had to fill their pages with something while they were waiting for the Stephen Ward trial to begin. And it was discovered that Rachman had slept with Mandy Rice Davis and Christine Keeler. And it was... All right, I will do, Linton, thanks. It was clear that because he was involved with these players in the Profumo trial, that they could fill their pages with scurrilous stories about him. There was also a deep, deep vein of anti-Semitism in their reportage of Rachman. So that became more than just a story about this landlord. Then I began to think about, why did he want to rent to newcomers? And also, I mean, this is a real question. There was a lot of Jewish migration from Central Europe into Britain after the Second World War. Many of those migrants became pillars of British society, founding publishing houses, becoming members of parliament, becoming prominent medical people. Why did Rachman go this way and want to engage with the downtrodden, if you like, or the wretched of the earth? What was it in his soul that made him seek kinship with West Indians and with prostitutes? And you can't write about that in an article. You have to do something else to get to, what I was just saying. If you're going to get to what he's thinking when he wakes up at 2 o'clock in the morning and remembers Poland in 1939, that's not an article, that's interior unspooling.
So this story about migration, which appears, because I read the article after I'd read the book. I'd read the article.
You read it today?
Yes, I did. Yes. Thank you for that, Carol. Yes. Yes. I finished the book this morning, and then I read some articles. Yes. Thanks. I'm just thinking of how I'm just thinking of how I can get you below the knees later. That the story that I thought centered Victor, that's how I read the book, that it centered the man from the Caribbean, actually starts in your mind with the centering of the Jewish character, and then bringing Victor in afterwards.
Yeah, because, well, here's another side spin on this. At the time, I was already thinking about Jewish migration from Central Europe, because I wanted to write something about, in fact, when I was in Leeds, I've lost track of that. On Tuesday, when I was in Leeds, I was wandering around the Chapeltown, the black community, because, and finding there's a synagogue. There's a lot of synagogues in Chapeltown, but there's one in particular that was founded in 1947 by my old history teacher from when I was at school. So I was already trying to write something about him, because he got out of Berlin in July 1939, one of the very last people. And I've always been fascinated by my odd relationship with this guy, because he was always giving me lines, because I was always misbehaving. But he sort of liked me for some odd reason. And he knew that I liked history. But I irritated the hell out of him, I think. Yet I felt a great affection for him, because he had a very thick German accent, and everybody else took the piss out of him because of his German accent. But I kind of quite liked it. So I was already thinking about this guy and about the confluence of, post-war Jewish migration or pre-war Jewish migration and history and the black community before I got to... So it was already in my head, and I guess that's the window that I was tiptoeing through, not just because of Rackman, but because of my old teacher.
I don't want to put you on the spot here, but I'm minded of being 10 and the Holocaust miniseries coming on. I was 10, and my mum made me stay up to watch it. And she said, "This is your story too," which I didn't fully understand. Still not sure I fully understand, but I partly understood it. It was the late 70s, and it was like, look, this is a story about injustice and pain and violence, and there is something of you in this. Is what
What did you think she was seeing? What did you think she was?
It was. I think she was making a connection of pain and of kind of indiscriminate injustice that. And this is how bad it can be. That there's that line from James Baldwin where he talks, I'm going to get it wrong, but it's something around like, I'm only interested in my pain insofar as I can connect it to other people's pain. That otherwise, what use of it? That otherwise it's just me being miserable. And I think it's Nature of Blood, one of your other books, where there is a Jewish character in the camp, I think. And throughout reading the book, I was interested in that sometimes very fragile, usually fragile, but nonetheless almost inevitable relationship between black people and Jews, whether it's here in Notting Hill, if it's in Harlem, if it's in areas of Chicago, or your teacher in Leeds, where you seem to find a counterpoint in each other, even if you can't exactly articulate why. I just wonder if you want to talk.
Yeah,
talk
and
about
I think that's true, but I think it's slightly different because Baldwin has a very good essay about the relationship between the Jewish community and the black community, and there's a great antipathy in African American Jewish relationships, or historically there has been some antipathy. I don't really find, I was interested in what your mom was thinking, because I think the word that I always think of when I think of both historical diasporic narratives is vigilance. Watch. Watch really carefully. Vigilance, look. They're not the same narratives, but there is a kind of reciprocal empathy, which I think the guy in the novel has, given his experiences, why he's renting out these properties. There was a reciprocal empathy that I think my history teacher had towards me, as opposed to the other kids. I think he arrived in 1939 speaking German. He had to reinvent himself in a country. He lost his country, he lost his family, he lost all his family. He had to reinvent himself in a country that wasn't always welcoming to him. And I think his synagogue is right in the heart of the black community. And I think he looked at me in the classroom as a little Biafro 12-year-old and probably thought, he can do better than arsing around, and I'm going to be the one to tell him. And I'm grateful. No, I'm not that grateful. but he spoke up.
You were the sort of victim of high expectations.
I was, yes.
The other thing that I think is really important and interesting about the book is the span of it. When I've seen you do books that have covered different periods before, they're usually more discrete as opposed to being kind of running through it. That the story one might argue that the story starts in the 30s, even if the book doesn't start in the 30s, but it goes all the way through to kind of 2012, 2013, and there are these little reference points that let you know where you are. It's the London Olympics, or Charles and Di's wedding, or I don't remember if the 58 riots are in there, but they're but it's Twiggy and
the 81 riots are
The
in there.
81 riots are in
and
there.
Cynthia Jarrett.
That's
and
right.
Brixton, yeah.
And the way in which, because you referred earlier to, particularly when you're in a country that doesn't want you, but the language of racism, it develops, it changes, doesn't it, throughout? And I just wonder if you can speak to that a little bit, the challenges of writing over sort of 70 years and also in these different places in such a kind of panoramic kind of way.
Well, the book traverses the two most optimistic decades in post-Second World War British life, which is the 1960s and the 1990s, with Tony Blair's Cool Britannia, and then 60s Carnaby Street swinging London. So I wanted to get the idea that there was almost a kind of like, British history after the Second World War is not just like that. It goes through these periods of confidence. We feel confident about it. Is it Oasis? Is it Blur? Is it the Stones? Is it the Beatles? We go through periods of great cultural confidence, and then you go through the 3-day week in the 70s, and Callahan and Wilson, so I wanted to try to capture some of that turbulence by trying to suggest that it's not a straightforward story. And it's a story of cultural reinvention in Britain, as well as the evolution, the awkward and sometimes reluctant acceptance of Britain's transformation into a multicultural, multiracial country, the most multicultural and multiracial country in Europe. So there's a sort of domestic story, and then there's a sort of more international story with a wider lens. And they live side by side, and they feed off each other, but it's not been easy, as everybody in this room knows. It's not been easy to move from the words that were acceptable and attitudes that were acceptable and attitudes that were legal in 1960 to where we are now, where they may not be legal, but that doesn't mean they're not still thought. They may not be articulated, but that doesn't mean that they're still not felt. So you're right, you have to find ways of suggesting we're not in Disney World here. Just because we are a multiracial country, we've not entered a state where, what's the phrase the Americans use? Post-racial. That's just nonsense. We've not entered this Disney World. We still have difficulties, even if we may be policing our vocabulary, we still have great difficulties.
The silences, I do want to come back to the silences, because it's so central to the book, the inability to articulate the pain, or to tell the story, to tell your story, isn't just true for Victor and Peter. It feels like it's also true for Ruth, and we learn a little bit less about Lorna, but somewhat true for Lorna, who is Victor's first wife. And I'm interested in how it's gendered, because the men seem to struggle in a very particular way, and the women seem to try in a very particular way. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, in a sort of broad brush response, Gary, I would just say, you know, Britain's a very, very patriarchal society, a tremendously patriarchal society. The Caribbean is not. You know, the Caribbean is a matriarchal society. So for a lot of women from the Caribbean migrating to Britain, there was the shock of the weather, there was the shock of not being recognized. You know, hey, I know Empire Day. They're like, you know, you want to work on the buses? You know, so there's a shock of rejection, but there's also the shock that being a woman, being a Caribbean woman, you occupied a different role in a deeply patriarchal society. For men, it was like a playground. You know, this is best illustrated, of course, we both know this because we've talked about this book, is best illustrated in Selvon's novel The Lonely Londoners, which is essentially, 1956, a group of West Indian men in London behaving badly. But behind their pain is the fact that they thought basically they were going on some kind of jaunt where they could get out from under the vigilance of Caribbean women who were going to tell them no, no. But there's a price to be paid for behaving badly and foolishly and irresponsibly. But it is gendered. It's always gendered. Everything's gendered. So to pretend it's otherwise is kind of crazy.
And the kind of, I'm minded of a couple of times when I've written things, and I've been commissioned to write things. One was when Obama was standing just before the election, and I wrote a piece about, because my son was born the same weekend that he declared, and you got very little direction generally at The Guardian about what you should or shouldn't write. And in this case they were like, but it will be hopeful, because they knew I had criticisms of Obama even before he had stood, or I wanted to critique him rather than just, revere him. And they said, this will be positive, won't it? It will be, uplifting. And similarly, the work I'm doing now on Black Europe, when I spoke to someone in the publishing industry, they said, but it will be uplifting. And it's more important, and this is non-fiction, it's more important to them that it's uplifting than it was true, I thought. And this book is it doesn't come with rosy conclusions. It's not that I wonder why, because conclusions often aren't rosy, but I guess I'm interested in how you came to the conclusion that would be where it would go, or didn't you really have a choice?
Didn't have a choice, because you're following people's lives, and so you can't impose sort of rose-tinted glasses on a narrative, because these are people's lives, and their lives go where they're going. I don't think. I mean, somebody asked me a question in Leeds on Tuesday, and well, it wasn't a question. She made a statement. She says, "I loved it, but it's kind of gloomy." I said, I don't think it's gloomy. I said, I don't think so, because one character, all characters should make a journey in fiction. You don't want to leave a character at the end of a novel exactly the same as when you met them at the beginning of the novel. They have to make some kind of a growth to understanding of themselves or their situation. But one character does make a significant growth to make a decision to change her life. She takes, so that in itself to me is it's a small decision, but it has huge ramifications because you get locked into, making a kind of peace with a mediocre sense of yourself and a mediocre sense of your life. But to break out of that in your 60s and decide, no, I have to. So I don't think that's gloomy. I also think, it's not for me as a writer, but it's also not for me as a reader to worry too much as to whether or not I am feeling uplifted. If I want to feel uplifted, I got plenty of music I can listen to that is uplifting. I've got stuff I can, but I'm trying to read to understand people's lives, and sometimes people's lives are a little gloomy at times. But I didn't agree with the person who felt that the overall gaze was towards penumbra. I just thought, no, that wasn't my intention.
When you're writing, because you've spoken a couple times now this evening where you're writing fiction, but your characters are real. You refer to them as though you're real. Do they dictate to you, or are you dictating to them? If you see what I mean.
I don't know. I can't make them do things that they don't want to do. So, I'm not going to suggest it's like, I have a kind of Ouija board and I just like follow wherever they go. But if I have their voice, and the easiest way I can maybe explain this is, first of all, I have to have their voice before I can write. I mean, I spend years thinking about characters. I'm not that lazy. But I have to, I call it pushing the down button on the lift on a character. I have to, at a certain point, I have to trust that the lift is going to go down and I'm going to sink and know more and know more. The more that I know about a character, and it takes years to know them, the more that I'm following the voice, I'm following what hopefully the truth of their lives. I don't know where it's necessarily going, but I know when to stop. But it's a strange, weird, symbiotic relationship with these people's lives, because they have all that time that is spent waiting, and most of the time, any novelist will tell you this, most of your time writing a novel, you're waiting. You have to cultivate a tremendous patience. You wait. And once they've released their story, or once they start to release their story to you, your job is to listen. It's obviously never to judge, but it's to listen. And that process of waiting and listening can take a very long time. But along that axis of waiting and listening, you're always grateful, because it's like that person is trusting you with their story. And your job is to not judge. Your job is to listen and try to represent it. But it's like when you get on a bus, Gary, or a plane or a train, and the person next to you starts to talk. You're like, earbuds, headphones, because you don't want to know their story, because they're giving it up too easily. It's just like, bleh. And you think, because they're going to do that to the person on the next plane or train or bus they get onto, and then the next one. So there's nothing about you It's just you happen to be the idiot in 22A, you know, and you have to deal with their story. You're waiting for the person that doesn't say anything, because their story is going to be more interesting, because they're not saying anything, but you think you can tell there's something that they've got. That's what I mean. It takes years to get the story out of them, and I don't know how to get it out of them any quicker. Otherwise, I'd be buying the drinks tonight. But I just don't know.
I want to end this bit by really moving on from there. That you know, you're sitting next to this person, they're telling you this story, and I wondered as I was reading it, because I know that you did live in Notting Hill, and that a significant part of the book is set in Notting Hill. I also know that you live in America now, and you have children there, but you come back often, and so I'm wondering, and this isn't a therapy session, but I'm just wondering what you gain and what you lose from a sort of state of not quite permanent migration. You're settled there, but you come back a lot. From that state, that kind of being both in and in between places.
Well, I mean, it's to my mind, as I get older, it's really very clear to me. I've always liked the anonymity of living in a place where I don't feel any umbilical cord to the United States of America. I don't feel I'm not affected in some ways, because America didn't make me a writer. Whatever screw up I have in my consciousness, whatever anxieties that I grapple with on a daily basis, they're the fault of Britain. You know? So they're not America's fault. Most writers are formed before they're 16 or 17. I mean, whatever they're going to write about, it's already happened to them by the time they're 16 or 17 years old. And I grew up here. I went to school here. You know, I was stopped by the police here before I was ever stopped by the police. I was stopped by the police at 10 here, you know. Oi, darky, where you going? Right. I get stopped by the police in America, but it's a very different encounter than when you're 10. So whatever anxieties or things I'm trying to understand or work out, they were inculcated into me in this country. The United States of America has a whole bunch of problems and a whole bunch of issues, but they also have a whole bunch of writers. And that's for them to deal with. I'm interested in here, because to be interested in here is to be rather self-consciously interested in me.
Did any of that change as you became a father? So for me, I lived in America for 12 years, and both of my kids were born there. And before, it's not like, I get very irritated when people say, I didn't used to care about the environment, but then I had children. I'm like, really? Is that what it took? Like, you can just figure it out for yourself. But what did change for me was, and this is a non-fiction journalist, but that America was like anthropology for me. There was an arm's length, there was a distance that I could look at it as though from afar, because I wasn't from there. And that started to change with having kids there, and that suddenly the thing that someone was saying to me at some Republican rally wasn't just interesting. It also echoed what a teacher had said to me 2 days before that I'd found I'd skin in the game, basically. Yeah. And I wonder how how having kids has it changed that relationship with where you are and where you're from? And I'm assuming also that they wouldn't know Britain particularly well, you know.
Yeah, my two boys do know Britain,
Okay.
because they come over here every year,
Right.
and so and they also have British passports as well as American passports. But I understand what you mean about having skin in the game now and it upping the anxiety stakes on living in that society. But you know, kids are very resilient, very perceptive. I took them to Mount Vernon, you know, to George Washington's house last year, and we were in the ante room with the park ranger before we go into the house. And, you know, she lowered her voice and she said, you know, you do understand, you'll see the room where George Washington died, and you'll also be aware that you've walked around a plantation today. And, you know, yes, unfortunately, Mr. Washington owned 471 slaves, and my eldest son said, Jesus Christ, how many slaves does one guy need? So I thought, they'll be okay, you know, they'll be fine. So.
Or not, in Trump's America.
Yes.
Look, I want to open it up to the audience. Questions preferable to comments. If you've got a comment, keep it short. And I also have a microphone, so I can outshout you. So there's a person here. The room's quite dark, so you will put your hand up high and wave it around. Yes.
Thank you for that. My question is, what do you do when you get stuck?
What do you do when you get stuck?
I watch telly. You know, I do something else. There's no point in banging your head against a brick wall. You mean, you have to have strategies. You know, there's no right to be able to write a book, and there's no big deal about writing a book. You write a book because you got something to say, and if it's not coming, do something else. You know, so I don't really regard it as a wonderful, mystical gift that you have to, you know, it's a job, you know, and if you get stuck, do something else. But you have to have patience. There's a very practical element that I'm not telling you, which is somebody has to pay you when you're stuck. You still have to eat, and you still have to pay your rent, and you still have to live, and you still have to, you know. So, you know, that's something that you should, if you want to write, that's something you should figure out early. How are you gonna pay for your time? Because time is critical. So how are you gonna buy the time to work? But that's another thing. If you've got the time and it's not working, then don't bang your head against a brick wall. Just do something else.
Yes.
This is kind of following on from what you were just talking about. So we met in the 90s in Canada, and you said to me at that point, this is totally selfish as well, but you said to me, people of color, black people in America are looking for tolerance, and sort of explaining, you know, because I'd never met a black British person, having grown up mostly in Canada. People in America are looking for tolerance, black people, and black people in the UK are looking for understanding. And this is very selfish, but hopefully will serve somebody else. Can you speak to that a bit more now? I have an understanding of it, but just any further thoughts, especially given where we're at, kind of.
I don't know what I was talking about.
I never know what you're talking about. Don't ask me.
Well, you said you have an understanding, a better understanding. What do you think I might have meant?
I'm just thinking of the history of this country just thinking of the history of this country with regard to black people, how all different kinds of black people came to this country, very different from how black people were sent to, dropped, deposited in America, and also just thinking about slavery, that kind of thing, how it sat in America versus how it sat here. Here it's represented by lovely big houses. There it's by George Washington's slave quarters kind of thing. So that's sort of was my understanding.
You know what I might have been thinking of?
It's very profound.
Well, I mean, you know, it's probably late at night.
I was going to say, was he high?
Okay, was that your payback?
Not yet, not yet.
What I may have been thinking about is, and when you were saying that, is that there is a very, there's a difference in the way in which black people arrived in the United States to the way in which they arrived in Britain. For instance, about 20 years ago, I wrote a novel about a black American performer, Burt Williams, who was a very famous comedian and minstrel person at the beginning of the 20th century. But my interest in him was he was from the Bahamas. If he'd have been a black American, I don't think I'd have written about him. But I wanted to write about him because he arrived, as most Caribbean people do, with a certain confusion. And that confusion is built around the word expectation. Caribbean people expected to be recognized as part of the family, as the mother country, empire. They expected to be recognized. They expected to be part of a broader family. Most African Americans have no understanding of any expectation. There's not a single African American, not one, who wanted to be in America, not one. They're the only group in the United States who did not want to come to the United States. Every other migrant wanted to come, not African Americans. Every single one, no. So, people say, I don't understand why there's still a problem with the black community. Well, I think I understand why. In this country, I understand the profound depths of betrayal that Caribbean people feel. Because they were sold a bum deal. It's called empire. You were told you're a member of the British Commonwealth, the British Empire rather, you're going to come and you're going to be part of a community. They were going to recognize you, understand you. You're going to be welcomed. You were recruited in many cases to come to this country. And then you came and you fought in the Second World War. You flew the RAF planes. And then you were called certain things and not given jobs and not given. So I understand the deep disappointment. So there is a very strong difference in the tangential relationship of black Americans to America and Caribbean people to this country. So maybe that's what I was banging on about late at night, you know.
Yeah, I think give him a few more whiskeys and see what he says tonight. I mean, one thing I understand by what you're saying, and it's quite a good. It's almost like a parlor game, isn't it? It's like, guess what Caryl meant, and that like you could like set whole A-level to kind of text on the basis of like whatever you say tonight. We'll just wrap it up and put it in a thing and give it to some 18-year-olds to figure out. But it's also that white people in Britain not understanding. So I came across, because of empire, because of the distance, I was in the National Archive, and I came across this survey that the Colonial Office did in 1948, the year of Windrush, asking people what they knew about empire. Half of British people could not name a single colony. This was while Britain occupied much of Africa, much of the Caribbean. Half people couldn't name a single colony. At least one person named Lincolnshire as a colony. And so, and this is a year of Windrush. So these people are coming, and large numbers of British people are, well, who are they? Where are they? I think it was George Lamming who said, like, we have met before. But if you can't remember that you met someone before, then that has no meaning. So the Caribbean people come knowing. My mum came assuming that British people will also have read Shakespeare because she was made to read Shakespeare and he was bloody British. And turning up here and realizing that they didn't know. And I think it speaks to our current sort of pathology around migration and immigration, that kind of, if you take the Sivanandan aphorism, well, we are here because you were there. Well, if you don't know where you were, even while you were there, I mean, these are people forgetting in real time, then kind of we have this struggle here to say that you do understand how this works. You do understand, why we're here, why you have a responsibility in this country or that country, or whereas, however racist a white American gets, they won't deny that they were involved in slavery, not them personally, but the white people were involved in slavery, or that white people were involved in segregation. It was right there. They might say they don't care. They might say it was a good thing. They might say get over it. But they're not going to say we didn't do it. Whereas British people do that often. They do it. They deny they're doing it while they're doing it. So I think there is that also in terms of understanding, of just trying to kind of reconcile this place with its past, when its past didn't take place in this place. So much of its past didn't take place in this place. That may also have been what you meant. Who knows? Give me a few whiskey, see what I say. Anybody? I see a hand there.
Hi.
Hi.
We met in the 80s, but I'm not going to quote anything you said to me at all. I just have to have a brief comment before I ask the question. I was very interested when you said that the word you felt described perhaps the comparison of experience of Jewish refugees and their experience to Afro-Caribbean ones was vigilance. And Gary talked about what was his mother on about, getting him to watch the Holocaust. I want to suggest that actually both experiences are about racism, and I don't want to have the elephant in the room, but annihilation on the basis of ethnicity or race is very significant in whether it's literal annihilation or catastrophic loss of the self, which is something you talked about. I learned yesterday from a professor friend in America that he can no longer write a proposal for funding if he uses the word trauma. And I wondered, given I think you are probably writing novels that in some sense stem from trauma, whether you fear in publishing or in any future emanation in America the oppression of this kind of thinking.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are in, I don't personally worry, but I think I worry for a whole bunch of people in the humanities, not just writers, but photographers, journalists, dancers, musicians, painters. Yeah, a lot of people are going to have the possibility of creative self-expression curtailed. It's not just funding that's going to be cut, it's going to be the spaces and the outlets to exhibit, publish, distribute their work is going to be cut. Or it's going to be cut and subject, before the cut, subject to a kind of reactionary scrutiny. You know, there'll be a, excuse me? Well, yeah, I think that's probably a more accurate way of putting it. Yeah. Yes, exactly. I think that's probably going to be a part of what happens. How that. The reason I say I'm not worried for me is because, you know, I'm at the tail end of something. I'm not at the beginning of something. But there's a lot of people, a lot of young people, a lot of young, creative, intelligent, smart people who won't even embark on that journey because they will be knocked back At the first challenge that they meet, they'll be knocked back. They'll get up again and go again. They'll be knocked back, and then they'll have to think seriously about whether this path is something for them. So yeah, that does concern me. And I'm not even going to get into things that are slightly less pernicious, but I worry greatly about AI. You know, seriously, and how that's going to affect creativity. That's not necessarily politicized, but it's also not necessarily unpoliticized as well. So,
we have time for one more question, Jess. So, yes, the person here.
Thank you. You asserted towards the end of the very interesting talk that children are resilient. And I'm interested to know whether you think the loss of self that comes with migration impacts children to a lesser or a different extent than to people who've migrated later in life.
This is because you migrated as a child, didn't you?
Yeah. No, I think I listened again. There's an Archive on 4 program, a Radio 4 program about Kindertransport that I sort of saved on my phone, and I listened to it again. And listening to the testimonies of those children who came to this country, often when they were 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and realizing the impact that it had on their lives and the destabilizing effect that it had on their lives, makes me realize that children may be resilient, but they're not protected from actually being thoroughly rearranged by these kinds of journeys and these kinds of either voluntary or involuntary migrations. They can completely disrupt a child's life and they never get over it.
So that does bring us to the end. I want to be sure to make sure that you know there are books at the back. I think you're going to sign. Carol's going to sign.
If I may interrupt, we'll be signing on the table on the left of the stage,
Okay.
but you can still grab a book at the
Right.
back of the room.
So the books are at the back, but the signing will be down here. Thank you. Forget everything I said at the beginning about what happens. It was a lie. I didn't actually finish the book this morning. I just read the cover. It was, the book came late. And the book did come late, but here's the point. I was very worried that I wouldn't finish it because it came so late. But actually, it was very, you say this in the wrong way, and it can sound like an insult for the kind of books that Caryl writes, but it was an easy book to read. The themes aren't easy, the characters aren't easy, it's not Harry Potter, but it's a readable, profound, and incredibly moving book that covers a lot of space in a relatively little amount of space. It covers a lot of time, covers a lot of issues. The characters are complex. I very much recommend it to you. Buy Caryl a drink, see what he says, and then come back, 10 years' time, and see what he says again. Caryl Phillips, thank you very much.